So now we look at the total costs in the short run. Now let's also look at the averages. Now, in general, whenever we talk about an average, we talk about it as the total divided by the quantity. And so using our terminology that we use, so the average total cost, which can either be ATC, average total cost, or just TC, total, um, oops, or just AC, average cost, is going to be your total cost divided by the number of the output quantity. Okay? So it's the total cost of production divided by the number of units you produce. Your average variable cost is going to equal your variable cost divided by the quantity. It's going to be ABC. Your average fixed cost is going to equal your total fixed cost divided by the quantity. So again, any of these averages is going to be the total divided by the quantity. The marginal cost, which we've talked about, is the additional cost of an additional unit. It's the cost of the last unit produced. And so with the marginal cost, it's going to be your change in total cost divided by your change in output. So it's the cost of an additional unit. So let's look at another example here. So when we go over here, we have, okay. So let's look at an example where we have our output, so Q of 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and our total cost. Now, in this example, if this is all that I gave you, you could find, actually I could even take this out, you could find your fixed cost, your variable cost, average fixed, average variable, and marginal, all from this. So, you might say, well, I don't understand. So there's one easy place to start. So if you remember, when you produce zero, so your variable cost depends on how much you produce. And so if you produce no output, your variable cost then is going to be zero. Okay. Your fixed cost then is equal to your total cost when you produce nothing. So when your quantity is zero, all costs you have, if you're not producing anything, the only costs you have are your fixed costs. Now you also know that your fixed cost doesn't change, right? Because it's fixed. And so no matter how much you produce, you have that same amount, you have that same fixed cost. Now again, your variable cost is going to equal, so going back to this, sorry. So your total cost is going to equal your variable cost plus your fixed cost. Right? And if you just switch out here, you find that your variable cost is going to be whatever your total cost is less your fixed cost. So that 16 is made up of the fixed cost of 10 and the variable cost. And by simple subtraction, you can find that to be 6. And if we do that all the way down, we get 10, 12, 16, 22, 30, and 40. Okay? So these are our total costs, which we've talked about before. And as you can see, you see those same general shapes for the totals that we discussed up here. So now let's look at the averages and the marginal. So the average, and again, any average is the total divided by the quantity. Okay. So your average total cost is going to equal your total cost. Actually, we can't do it at 0, but no. So your total cost, your average cost is going to be the total divided by the quantity. Your average fixed cost is going to equal your total fixed cost divided by the quantity. Your average variable cost is going to equal your total variable cost divided by the quantity. All right, and finally, the marginal cost. Now again, the margin is not the average. So the marginal cost is going to equal your change in total cost divided by change in quantity. So again, when you go from quantity goes from 0 to 1, cost goes from 10 to 16, so it goes up by 6. And we go through. And so here we have our averages and our marginal costs kind of graph there. So if we go back here and we look at this in a little more cleaned up version, this is what these curves are going to look like. And there's some basic characteristics about them. So first, let's just look at our marginal cost. So we talked about how initially our marginal cost may fall, but then it's going to be mostly increasing. And that goes back to when we talked about supply. Average fixed cost is always going to be falling. Because if you think about it, the average fixed cost is the total fixed cost divided by the quantity. Well, the total fixed cost never changes, and so as quantity gets larger, the average is going to get smaller. The other thing is that the average cost, just as with the total, is going to equal the average variable cost plus the average fixed cost. So the average cost is always going to be greater than both the average variable and the average fixed. However, the gap between the average total cost and the average variable cost is going to get smaller as output gets bigger. And so the reason why is because, again, to get the average total cost, it's average variable plus average fixed. And if the average fixed cost is always getting smaller, the average variable is going to make up a larger portion of that average total. And so it's going to get closer and closer. Here's the other thing to note here. If we look at the average cost and the average variable cost and look at the marginal cost, although it may not be, that's a little better. So here's what it is. The average cost and the average variable are going to be directly impacted by the marginal. So the average cost is increasing when the marginal is greater than the average. Okay? So if marginal cost is greater than average, the average cost is going to be rising. If the marginal cost is less than the average cost is going to be falling. And the same with average variable. So why is that? Think about it in terms of test scores. All right. So let's say that 10 people hand me an exam, and the average of that exam is a 90. So now an 11th person hands it in late. That 11th person got a 95. Okay. Now that 95, that's a marginal score. Okay, that's the additional score from an additional student. So that 95 is going to bring up the average. The same happens with costs. If the marginal cost is below the average, it's going to pull down the average. And if the marginal is above the average, it's going to pull it up. The same as what happened with test scores. So now, it's very, very important to especially understand the dynamics of these average cost curves. Because when we go through and when we start talking about the maximizing profits, the different market structures, getting through these average cost curves, especially in the short run, is going to be very, very important. And so we're going to be coming back to this a lot.